Hello, everyone. We'll just wait a few moments as everybody joins us. So welcome, and welcome everybody if you're joining us for the first time or if you're returning after you've seen the first two webinars that we've done in this series.
Yeah, I'll still see people coming in, so give it a couple of minutes before we get started. Hope everyone's had a good break over Easter.
Yeah. It's definitely feeling more like spring/summer in Copenhagen right now. It's very sunny.
It's the same here in Glasgow, Scotland.
Yeah.
But it's fresh. It's sunny, but blue skies, but fresh.
Yeah, it's the same here.
Cool.
Good.
I think we got a stable number now, so we
yeah.
Go.
So welcome everyone to our third webinar. How does open access fit with funder requirements, which is in our series From Research to Publication, a researcher's guide to open access. The previous two webinars that we've done are now available to view in the events section of our website, kronoshub.io. So if you want to check those out, please go ahead. So I'm Laura Davidson. I'm a customer care specialist at Kronos Hub. Outside of my role at Kronos Hub, I am also a PhD researcher, so I completely understand the highs and lows of the PhD research journey. Prior to working here, I worked in universities in the UK for around 10 years, both as an administrator and as a lecturer. So that's really when my open access journey began. It was then. And I am joined by my colleague, Romy Beard. Romy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Laura. So I'm Romy. I've been working in scholarly communications for the last 17 years. I worked at publisher, aggregators, technology providers, and for the last 7 years, I worked for a small charity that worked with developing countries and also signed a lot of open access agreement, APC waivers and discounts. So I'm familiar with that side of things. And I've been with Kronos Hub for about 18 months now, focus mainly on the publisher relations side, as well as running these exciting webinars to dive into different aspects of the open access journey. So I think our agenda for today, as Laura said, we've already run 2 webinars in the series. The first one was a general introduction to open access. Second one was focused on APCs, and today we'll specifically focus on funder requirements. So do a brief introduction to the context, funders, and open access before we review some of the basics that we've looked at in the first webinar in the context of funders, where this is quite useful, and in case you missed the first webinar, so you haven't missed anything, we'll go over that again briefly. And then we'll look at some funder policies as well as funding eligibility requirements and the difference between the two. And then very valuable look at a lot of questions that Laura gets in her role at customer care to do with funders and why are things not being paid and what are common issues, and you, as always, some resources as well.
Great. Okay, so we're going to kick things off with a poll. I don't know if my connection has maybe gone a little bit.
You're very quiet.
Okay. I need to shout. So let's start with a poll.
No. Yeah.
Is it better? Let's start with a poll.
Yeah. No, it's fine. It was a lag with you talking, so that's. Okay. I don't know if it's me.
Hopefully it stays stable for the rest of the webinar. Okay. So the first poll we'd like to kick off with, is your research funded? I'll just launch that for you now. And it's a simple answer, yes or no. I'll just wait as your answers come through, and then I will reveal the results. Still some answers coming through. Okay, I think that's everybody. So I'll just share the results with you all. So is your research funded? So we have yes, 56% of our participants, and no, 44%. So that's really interesting. So the majority of people who are joining us today, that's great. You are research funded. So there'll be lots of interesting topics for you that we're going to discuss today. Okay.
Great, thanks, Laura. So first of all, just wanted to touch on, in case you're new to this, what is the fund? What role do funders play in the context of research? So they issue grants, i.e. they pay money to cover researchers' projects and different aspects of it, such as salaries, supplies, research equipment, travel expenses, and also charges that involved with the research to actually get published. And in this case, what we're talking about is article processing charges for open access publishing, specifically in this context. So here's some examples of funders that you might have come across, like Horizon 2020, European Union, UK Research and Innovation, Swiss National Science Foundation. There's lots of other different funders out there, obviously, that you might have come across. So those are just some examples. So what role do funders play in the context of open access? Well, one of the issues that has happened is that because funders pay quite a large chunk of money to researchers, and a substantial proportion to that is to cover open access fees, the issue was with articles not being published in open access. So public money or funder money is essentially contributing to research still being locked up. And that's a bit of an issue, because a lot of funders say that because, you know, they pay for the research, they want the research that's written up about the actual research, the research article, to be openly available so everyone can benefit from it and not have it locked behind the paywall. So in about 2018, a group of funders formed Coalition S. It's about 20 funders, and they began agreeing on some next steps in order to drive the open access movement a little bit faster, because a lot of funders would maybe require that articles were archived in green but not necessarily published open access. So they pushed this really along by saying that research has to be published open access straight away or archived straight away. So here's the list of funders that have now signed up to Coalition S. I think it's 25, primarily Europe, some international as well. So this has really pushed things along in this direction to create more open access. And one of the kind of, not side effects, but perhaps the wrong word, that they've supported really is these open access agreements. So Plan S, for example, Coalition S is supporting quite strongly an initiative called OA 2020 that's advocating for open access agreements. And in conjunction with discussions with funders, those agreements have really taken off. And as you can see here, especially when you look at 2018 going up, then how many open access agreements were signed and how much more open access content has been published as a result of funders getting involved with this. And we'll talk detail about the open access agreements in our last webinar in the series on the 12th of May. So that's just a bit of context. Next, we wanted to look at different versions of articles because this will be very important when we look at the different funder policies. So there's 3 policies that we'll look at in detail, and in all of these versions come into play. So you have the submitted version, which is the version the author has submitted to the publisher system, the author accepted manuscript, which is the version as it has been accepted. So this could include revisions, for example, that were required for the article to be accepted.
I think we're experiencing some connection issues. Romy, are you still there? I haven't heard from her, okay. Please let me know in the comments if you're still able to hear both of us. Okay, I think Romy's coming back now. Hi.
Hi, I think I've
Did you have some connection issues?
Yep, I don't know when you lost me. I'm
You were
back.
talking about versions of articles. You were still on the slides, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you disappeared and I thought it was you that had gone, and then I realized
Yeah.
Sorry about that, everyone.
I wasn't sure, to be honest, with the connection issues.
Yeah, technology.
Yeah.
So I was talking about like author accepted version, which is what you can see on the left hand side, version of record, PDF. When it comes to archiving, it tends to be the AAM on the left hand side that's being deposited, whereas the VOR, the version of record, is the final published version. So you can see there's layout, the typesetting, there's also final editing done to this version. Both versions have been peer reviewed, so that's something to bear in mind. In terms of publishing versus open access, publishing and open access versus archiving, both routes are accepted by most funders. So the difference is that for publishing open access is the final version of record that has been made available immediately on the publisher's website, usually at a cost, especially for hybrid journals, whereas archiving tends to be free. It usually is the AGM that publishers allow to get archived. Sometimes it's also the version of record, the final PDF. Sometimes there's an embargo period that is applied, and that's an issue for some funders, as we'll see later on. And this is really the action here is on the author. The author has to archive their accepted version, so it's not a publisher action. It's the author that has to do something to comply with the requirements. Then in terms of types of open access, we've got hybrid open access, which is open access publishing in a hybrid journal, where you'll see a mix of open access and closed access articles that coexist together within the same journal. APC's article processing charges do apply for open access articles, and sometimes these are not eligible for funding by funders. So some funders will not fund open access publishing in hybrid journals. So that's something to be aware of. Gold open access publishing in a fully open access journal tends to be accepted by most funders. Some might have restrictions on licenses, so that's something to think about as well. And not all of these charge APCs. Some of them do, some don't. Now the next category that we talked about last time is bronze. This isn't really relevant for funders because it's at the decision of the publisher to make an article openly available. So it wouldn't be compliant with a funder, for example, because the author doesn't know if this is going to happen at the moment of publication, even if there's no APCs. Also, bronze doesn't tend to be for a permanent period of time. It could be like a limited period of time. For example, during COVID, some publishers opened up access. So bronze doesn't tend to be a compliant route in this context. Diamond, platinum, however, is essentially open access, gold publishing without a fee, no issue there. If it's the right license and you meet all the other criteria for funder requirements, that is not a problem usually. And then, as I mentioned earlier, archiving, green open access is accepted by most funders. Watch out for which version, is it the AAM or the VOR? Watch out for embargo period. And in some cases, licenses. Some funders like UKRI now require that the CC BY license is applied to the AAM, which is quite important. Yep, and here you can see an overview of the most common licenses, well, all the CC BY licenses that you might come across. CC BY is the kind of most open license, and most funders will require CC BY. Some might allow other versions, but it can be, for example, upon request, so authors might need to complete a form. For example, UKRI allows CC BY ND, but again, it's an exception only. So CC BY is the one that tends to be accepted. So even if you publish in a fully open access journal, watch out for which license is applied, because that's where you might not be compliant. Try to take us through this one, Laura?
Yes, I will. So we're going to take you through the different funder policies now. But before we take a look at the funder policies and the differences between them, we'll be going through the definitions of the different terms you might come across when receiving funding, which I'm sure many of you have already come across before. So there's the PI, which means principal investigator, and this is essentially the person who is responsible for the grant or the project. They will most likely be in charge of the research grant and are also likely to be the primary grantee holder, which then nicely leads on to grantee, and they are the person who has applied for and successfully received research funding. Often on grants, there will be more than one grantee. And again, I'm sure a lot of you are already aware of that. The third term that we have on here is grant ID and project ID. So funders will give grants an ID number that relates to the work that is being funded, and also that grant ID will also link to researchers as well. It can be referred to as a grant ID, but also in some cases can be called a project ID. However, just to confuse things more, funders use different terminology. So a project ID might refer to something different from a grant ID. I think we would advise always make sure to check these definitions with your funder to make sure you understand where you sit within this. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the OA policies and open access or article processing charge funding policies of different funders. So we're going to start off with FNR, who we actually process APCs for, and this is their open access policy. So it's quite simple. Research funded by FNR must be published open access, and this applies to grant funding given after 2017 and also applies to some funding and the PRIDE funding that they have from 2016. We'll say actually that this will be changing. So grantees from January 2021 will be following Plan S guidelines when they publish. And there's more information about that from the FNR on their website. And just for the context for today, we'll be using the example from 2017 to the end of 2020 when we're talking about APC funding and also their open access policy as well. So for FNR, there are two ways to meet the open access requirements. So it's either by depositing the publication in an online repository, which is the green route that Romy has just described, either immediately or after the publisher's embargo period ends. And the FNR have a list of suitable repositories for that on their website. The second way is to make the article available open access immediately by publishing in a hybrid or a gold journal. All articles published via this route must have a CC BY license. And that's important to remember when we go on to the next slide in a moment, because even if, for example, your published article is not funded by FNR, you still need to make sure that it has a CC BY license on it if it is published in a gold or a hybrid journal. In order to publish in a gold or hybrid journal, it is likely that the author will have to pay an article processing charge or an APC. FNR have some money that you can apply to fund this, and it's according to a set of criteria on the next slide. And we'll see here that the APC funding requirements differ a little bit from the open access requirements. There are more rules perhaps in what the FNR, in terms of what the FNR will pay, rather than just what complies with the dissemination of open access research. So first of all, the FNR will pay towards publishing in gold and hybrid journals. So that's the two models that they fund. They have a maximum APC funding of €2,500 for gold journals and €1,500 for hybrids. It must be published immediately open access if you're going to publish this route, no embargo. We have actually come across embargoes on articles that are published with a CC BY license. So that's something to be aware of. So it must be published immediately open access. The article must acknowledge FNR and the grant number, and the grant must have been given after the 1st of January 2017. And there are other certain grants that also can be eligible for this funding too. And of course, it's very important that the CC BY license is required in order to have this funding. Okay, so on the next slide, we have the second funder here, which is the Swiss National Science Foundation, who we also process APCs for. So we can look again at their open access policy, which actually is quite similar to the FNR. So grantees are required to make sure that, the previous slides, that all SNSF funded research is published publicly accessible without any restrictions. And this applies to all publications that are regarded as scientific output. So for example, that's articles, book chapters, and books. And again, they've got two routes that you can comply with this policy. So it's either you go for immediate open access, which is publishing in a gold or a hybrid journal, again, quite similar to FNR, or delayed open access, which is the green route, except there's a little bit of a difference here, where the SNSF require that you can only have an embargo period of 6 months for articles that are published in journals and 12 months for books and books chapters. And they're specific about the version published in the open access format that goes through the green route that's left, that's put in the repository. It has to be the author's accepted version, including the changes that were made after peer review, but it can be put in the repository without the publisher's layout. And again, they have on their website, they have recommendations for the type of repository that you can use. So it's either an institutional or a discipline subject specific repository. And again, it has to have unrestricted access without need for registration, and it's permanent and it's free to access at any time. So we'll look at the comparison between that and the APC payments eligibility. So the main thing to communicate about the SNSF in terms of the APC payment eligibility is that they only pay for APCs for articles that are published in gold journals. And I'm talking specifically about publishing in journals here. I'm not talking about books or book chapters. So they'll only pay for APCs in gold journals and journals that are listed in the DOAJ, which will come up in our resources, I think, at the end, but it's the directory of open access journals that you can find online that is, again, is openly accessible. There is a maximum funding limit if you do publish in a gold journal, and amounts that are over the maximum amount can be considered on a case-by-case basis. So that's a little bit different from the FNR, where they have a €2,500 limit for funding that they will give you if you publish in a gold journal. Again, must be published immediately, open access, no embargo, must acknowledge SNSF and the grant number in the article. The application for the APC funding must be made by a grantee who is also an author on the article. And the SNSF differ from FNR, where they have no specification about the license that you choose. So you can choose, like Romy showed the examples of the license, so you could choose CC by NC or CC by NCND as well as CC by. Okay, and then I think on the next slide, we have an example of how you can see the policy within the SNSF Kronos Hub Journal Finder. So at the top, we have the gold journal, and it states that the gold journal can be paid. And then the example on the bottom is a hybrid journal, which states that the hybrid journal cannot be paid by SNSF, but it is still compliant with their open access policy, which I think is the thing that can sometimes be a little bit confusing. So they will fund gold journals, and that is compliant as well, but also publishing with an open access route in a hybrid journal is also compliant with the open access policy. It's just that if you receive an invoice for an article processing charge, SNSF will not fund that.
But in that case, you could also archive the article, not pay the APC, as long as there's no embargo. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that is the advice that they give. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we've got a question here. I'm a PhD student and I'm going to submit a manuscript under the supervision of my principal investigator. Our project is related to grant number. Will my funder fund the OA publication charge, the APC? So this is a question that we often get in customer care. And it depends on the funder, really. And I think the advice that we'd give here is to check
that you are a grantee, because perhaps you are not a grantee. Maybe the principal investigator is the grantee. So for example, in the case of the SNSF, it should be the principal investigator or another named grantee on the grant who is also an author. If we're using SNSF as an example, they should perhaps make the application for the funding charge. And again, also as I've gone through the two different examples, there'll be other things that will mean whether or not the funder will fund the APC charge, the open access publication charge. So, you might need to make sure that you've got a CC BY license, for example, if you are an FNR grantee and researcher, or perhaps if you are an SNSF researcher, you'll have to make sure that the journal is a gold journal and different things like that. So the answer is yes and no, but just make sure that you comply with and check out the different eligibility criteria for your funder.
Thanks, Laura. So I'll take you through the next sample policy that we're going to dig into a little bit, UKRI. I've done a little bit of work for a company called JISC that works closely with UKRI to help implement this policy. And it's a little trickier, I would say, than the other two that we looked at. On the surface, it looks very similar, compliant routes for OA publishing, and just focusing on journals here are either the version of record, the final PDF is made available open access immediately under CC BY license. They do allow CC BY NC as an exception, but authors have to do request this as an exception, or the research article is made open access on a publishing platform, i.e. route 2. It's deposited, the AEM is deposited, but again, there's no embargo that can be applied, and also this must be under CC BY license. So both routes require CC BY license in the case of UKRI. And that's the general policy. So you can, be compliant with the policy if you follow that. But like Laura mentioned with the other two, there are restrictions on the funding, on which type of articles you can use. UKRI block grants, which are issued to the UK institutions, and that can be used to pay towards APCs. So publishing open access in a hybrid journal is compliant with the policy, but they will only pay for APCs or can only use parts of the funding if the journal meets certain conditions. So either the journal needs to be published, the article needs to be published under a JISC approved transitional agreement, or the journal needs to be a transformative agreement. So that's getting very complicated for authors to figure that out. And I put together this this overview, which is also on the JISC page, where we break down the difference between UKRI policy and eligibility for funding. And this applies as well to a lot of the other policies that we looked at. So for example, publishing open access in a fully open access journal, as long as you use CC BY, you're compliant with the UKRI policy and eligible for funding, so APCs will be paid for. However, publishing open access in a hybrid journal, as long as you use CC BY license, is compliant with the policy, but only eligible for funding if additional criteria are met. Like I said, the article needs to be published through a transformative agreement, or it's a transitional journal. So that makes it a little bit trickier. Publishing closed access in a hybrid journal, again, is policy compliant. The funding eligibility here doesn't come into play because there don't tend to be any fees associated with archiving. And if they were, they would not be covered. And most publishers don't charge for allowing authors to archive, but there is the trickiness of embargoes are not allowed, and you need to have a CC BY license applied to this. So this makes it a little bit tricky for authors. And if you'd ask the question, well, how can I know if a journal is included in this agreement or not? The journal checker tool is really the place to look at that as well as checking with your institution if a journal that you want to publish in is included in an agreement, or if it's a transitional, a transformative journal and would be eligible for funding. And I would advise authors to really contact their library, their contacts, their open access experts at their institution, who will be able to give, you know, very specific advice on their agreements, because a lot of that depends on which agreements your institution has signed. So let's move on now, unless we have any questions. If you have any questions at any time, please pop them in the chat or the Q&A and we'll try and answer them. But in the meantime, we've got a question here from our customer care team. Why won't my funder cover the APC for my article? And I think this leads us on to our common issues of why we might not be able, like, it might not be able to be covered.
Yeah, and it will vary from funder to funder, like you were just saying, Romy. So these are common issues why APC funding might be refused by a funder. So the wrong license has been selected, which is a funder requirement. So for example, if you're an FNR grantee and you have not chosen the CC BY license and there's no way to change that, then yeah, you would not be receiving funding. So the journal type, for example, hybrids, like in the case of SNSF, is not eligible for payment by the funder. The article is compliant with OA policy, but the APC cannot be paid for. So, for example, again, like with the case of SNSF, the article has been published in a hybrid journal with an open access license, but the APC cannot be paid for because SNSF do not pay for articles that are published in hybrid journals. There are additional charges on the invoice that are not covered by the funder and will have to be paid using money from elsewhere. So page charges, image charges, color charges, anything like that usually are not covered by the funder. But again, I would check that with your funder's regulations. So that could be one reason why the invoice will not be paid. And also it could be that the embargo period is longer than funder regulations. But I think that would really apply for the sort of really unusual situations where a publisher will offer an open access route, but only after an embargo period, which is the same as green, but you will have bought a CC BY license in order to do that. So that's quite an unusual situation, I will say, but we have seen that happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think with all of these, it's worth, again, you know, checking with any administrators at universities that help you manage this, and for them also to check with publishers, for example, the additional charges. We had a case where we managed, the funder said we can't pay this because I can't remember if it's SNSF or FNR, they only paid up to, like, I think €100 of admin charges, and this publisher was a higher fee, but they managed to roll it into the APC, so it was actually like labeled as one fee, and in total it still fit within the maximum, and that way it could be processed. So it's unfortunately an administrative, you know, an additional administrative burden, but if in the end it's paid for, it might be worth looking at all those options.
Yeah, I agree.
So there's another question we've received in the past. I didn't qualify for open access funding, so I chose the green route, which is something we've discussed. If you don't have funding, or if your funder doesn't pay for example, publishing open access in hybrid, you could publish closed access. Yeah. However, I discovered that the embargo period is 18 months and my funder requires an embargo of 6 months. What can I do?
It's a really difficult situation. But there are things that you can do. So, for example, the SNSF provide a guide on their website, and they recommend that you contact the publisher and request that as part of your research funding and as part of the criteria under which you've received the research funding, you have to publish open access under a specific set of rules. So they've provided this standard email for contacting publishers, just to state that, you know, that the manuscript needs to be made available within 6 months of initial publication in an institutional or discipline-specific repository. So that's one thing that you can try. Some publishers are more amenable to that than others. And then I think on the slide, there's another, the next slide, there's another.
Yeah, something we've not talked about, and again, that is I mean, what you're suggesting there with the SNSF is something you can do after the article's been published, really. Or perhaps it might be before, but it could be something that you could discuss afterwards. Whereas this is kind of a last resort rights retention strategy, which is something that Plan S has been advising to researchers really as a last resort if publishers don't offer compliant routes. Basically, the way it works is that authors at the point of submission make a statement that says, I'm applying a CC BY license to my AAM. It's a public copyright license, and I retain. This is what, as an author, I'm applying to my manuscript, and that would overrule any later license to publish or copyright transfer agreement, and that would then assure you that you can do as you please with your AAM and archive it immediately without an embargo. There's a bit of controversy around that, and obviously some publishers don't quite agree with that and might not allow that, but it's something that you can be aware of, that you can use as a last resort if you really must publish in certain journals. I think, I don't know if some publishers would not accept for that reason. It shouldn't influence acceptance, but I think that's yet to be seen how it will play out, but certainly something to be aware of. And then, as usual, we'll leave you with some resources. I haven't seen any questions pop up yet, but please do add them. We've talked about Sherpa Romeo in the previous webinars, and this one as well. It's a resource run by JISC where you can check what you like to do with each journal. Is there an embargo period? The thing to point out here is that on the Sherpa Romeo record, you have the general conditions, and then you sometimes have different options. And if you click on the kind of boxes that open up, you'll see special conditions for certain funders. So worth scrolling through that to see if there is a special condition for your funder that might be offered. So there are some exceptions that publishers do. They have their general policy, and then they say, well, actually, if you're funded by this and this and this funder, we allow you zero embargo AEM deposit with CC BY. That information should also be on the publisher's website itself, otherwise it wouldn't be in Sherpa Romeo, but that's a resource you can look at, as well as publishers' websites and journal pages. DOAJ is the Directory of Open Access Journals, which lists lots of fully open access journals. There's maybe a little bit of a lag, so very new journals might not be included in this, or if they can only be included once they have an ISSN and fulfill certain other criteria. So actually, Laura, you mentioned earlier, one of the funders said they only fund fully OA. Does it have to be in DOAJ? What if it's fully OA and it's not in DOAJ? Is it FNR?
I think that's still okay. And again, it's like refer to your funder, but essentially it's like they're happy if the journal is in the DOAJ, they are happy to fund it. That's essentially the way of looking around it. Yeah. And
I think DOAJ is a good resource for those kind of funders to find out, well, which journals are fully open access, and I know I can get funding covered for the APC charge, so that can be a good starting point to find journals.
Yeah.
You can also look at the Chronos Hub Journal Finder, where we've got 46,000 journals, and you can filter them by certain criteria, and you have information about the archiving options and licenses and funder compliance. And for the Plan S funders, this is pulled in from the Plan S Journal Checker tool, and so you have that information integrated into the Chronos Hub Journal Finder as well. The Plan S Journal Checker tool is more of a lookup for specific journals, so you can also use that separately, essentially accessible in a slightly different way, if you want to just do checkups. And then we leave you with some information about our webinar so far. As Laura has mentioned at the start, so this is the third webinar in the series. We started with the general intro to open access. Why should I care about open access that we ran? And then in March, we ran the webinar focused on article processing charges and how to deal with them. Today, we looked at funder requirements in detail. And the last webinar in the series, we'll look at open access agreements. So things like read and publish, publish and read, transformative, transitional, and so on. And that concludes then our series of four 4 webinars for researchers, a researcher's guide to open access. But we still have quite a bit of time today, so please put your questions in the chat, and if there's things that we haven't covered or things that you find confusing or not very clear, please let us know, and we can dig into that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Laura, what do you find the most confusing thing with dealing with these funding requirements from a customer care point of view?
I think it's the difference between what will be funded and what will not. So obviously, the difference between goals and hybrids, I think for SNSF researchers can be really difficult because they will have chosen an open access route, and sometimes publishers can call an open access route in a hybrid journal a gold route, which occasionally can make people think that they have published in a gold open access journal. So I think that's that can be kind of the trickiest thing, and also making sure that the correct licenses have been chosen and things like that, because sometimes not every publisher will give you a CC by default. They might only do that if, for example, you are a researcher that has received money from a Plan S funder or anything like that. So those are kind of the things that are at the top of my head. The things are maybe the most difficult to kind of get your head around and work out.
Yeah, definitely. It's a bit of a minefield. Johnny Rhodes has just asked where they can find the recordings from the first webinars. They're all on the Kronos Hub website. If you look at the events section, and I think you have to scroll down, you get the past events, and if you then click on them, you've got the recording. We'll also put the slides there, and a colleague in marketing usually writes a blog post about it, just if you don't want to watch the recording and you feel you want a bit more information than just looking at the slides, and that can be a good starting point as well. And feel free to share these recordings or the links with colleagues that you think might find this useful.
Yeah, and we also have short snippets of the webinars on our social media channels as well. So those are also useful as well, I think, for sort of quick answers to things, and to get an idea of what we are talking about in the webinars too.
Yep, definitely.
Yeah.
And we do have another question from Joni. Thanks. What happens if things go wrong with open access? Are there penalties? I guess you're referring to if you are funded but you essentially not compliant. So I think this comes down to the funder checks. I think this depends on each funder, how rigorously they check, to be honest. I have listened to someone, I think it was a Canadian funder, that spoke about something like 54% compliance. So they probably still pay, but they might not check that rigorously. I think funders becoming more kind of pedantic about that and making sure that everything they pay is actually compliant with the policy. But I think that depends on each funder. So Kronos Hub manages the APC payments for the Swiss National Fund and the Luxembourg National Fund, FNR. So our system obviously does these checks, and if flags up as actually you're not compliant, we try and resolve the issue before it's paid. So then everything that is paid is fully compliant, and also gets paid quite quickly. So it's maybe quite lenient in some ways, because we try and address the problem rather than sweep it under the carpet, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you said, Romy, it depends on the funder. But I do think if there is an honest mistake, which does happen, I think funders can be very understanding. And like you said, at Kronos Hub, with the funders that we work with, so we work with FNR and SNSF, and we also work with the University of Lausanne. They have an open access fund too, for their researchers. And we work with them to make sure that any issues that are arising are sorted out before payment, and also before maybe a license or is attached to an article or anything like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think it's worth, as a researcher, bearing in mind what are the restrictions, making sure it's compliant, and if not, like, try and address it beforehand.
Yeah.
That would be our advice.
Yeah, always, I think if there's something that doesn't make sense, because I think there's a lot of information, and I think as we were showing, there's like a difference between the open access policy, but then also if you have a funder that will fund the APCs, that is also different from the open access policy. So it's like you can publish anything open access, but it might not be, you might not be entitled to have the APC paid for, and because it doesn't match certain criteria. So it's always worth thinking about that, like just reaching out to somebody just to ask. So it's either the funder or maybe your principal investigator or an administrator at the university or your librarian team, just to see like what advice they can give you.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it is a bit of a minefield as it gets more complicated, with, you know, some of the hybrid restrictions where, like, publishing open access is compliant with the policy, but it might not be eligible for funding. And if the journal is part of a transitional agreement or read and publish agreement, which as an author you might not be aware of, a portion might come from your fund for that, for example. So I think that's another one to be aware of. If you publish through open access agreements, essentially you don't pay an APC at all. Everything is kind of managed in advance. So the two are kind of linked, and then the funder requirement become in a way less important, because it's decided at institutional level that the APC cost is paid for, and we'll talk in more detail about that in our last webinar, what that means for you as a researcher, essentially where you can publish for free, where APCs are covered.
Yeah, and I was just thinking as well, in the case of there being multiple authors as well on an article that are from different institutions around Europe or around the world, or that are based in different places, there could be different routes that you could go down that are worth exploring. So again, it's always worth looking at these policies if that can help out. You know, if you're in a group situation, perhaps the first author, their funder or their institution doesn't would not fund the APC, but maybe you as a grantee and an author at another institution with another funder is entitled to that funding. You can offer that as well. So it's always something to be aware of. And again, it's the same with read and publish agreements as well. So there could be somebody that's at a university that still has a quota left over, where you can publish in, it's usually a hybrid journal with an open access license for free because it's included within the agreement.
Yeah, really need to, and that's maybe something we haven't touched on today, restrictions on terms of authorship. So for the UKRI policy, for example, this applies not just to the corresponding author, but any co-author. So if there's 10 collaborating authors and one of them is funded by UKRI, they need to make sure that research is published immediately open access or archived immediately open access. They themselves would probably, if they're just a co-author, not be eligible. Perhaps they would be eligible for the APC payment. That makes it more complicated. But like Laura said, it's worth then checking, okay, out of the 10 authors, which one has an agreement at their institution that would cover the fees, and make sure that is put down as the corresponding author. That's definitely a way around the funding issue in a way as well. But yeah, compliance applies to all of the authors. So it's not just a corresponding author. So you need to check with your co-authors if they have a funding, even if it's not covering the fees, but if they have a funding acknowledgement made. So you might have multiple funding acknowledgements on one article, right, that you need to comply with. So, I mean, I would like to say in some way, it's not going to be differences. It's not irreconcilable differences. It's just some are like slightly more liberal and some are maybe more restrictive, in the sense that they want the research to be as open as possible. So if you're always going for the most open route, you're not going to offend any of the other funders. It's not an either or situation.
Yeah.
So, you know, if you stick with CC BY immediately away with CC, or AAM CC BY archiving, you're fine with all the funders.
Yeah, exactly. yeah, I don't think anyone will be upset if something is open access. It's
Exactly.
always the other way around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thanks for your questions, Joni. It's got us talking.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I think we'll wrap it up then. If
Yeah.
you have any other questions that pop into your head later, feel free to get in touch on social media, or if you drop us an email. And like Laura said, all the past webinars are on our website on the events page. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and hope to see you again on the last webinar on the 12th of May.
Bye-bye, everybody. Bye.